It's my pleasure to welcome all of you this morning to the Symposium on the Public Good, the Impact of Information Technology on Society. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the American Academy, we are the nation's oldest honorary society and an independent research policy center. Based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Academy conducts multidisciplinary studies of complex and emerging problems for our society, and has done so since 1780. The Academy was founded in the midst of the Revolutionary War by John Adams and a group of scholar patriots who believed that knowledge and learning were critical to the future of a new republic. In a sense, the Academy was the nation's first think tank. Current Academy research focuses on science policy and global security, nuclear energy and other forms of energy and their viability, risks, and benefits. We also are working on various forms of social policy, perhaps most notable the issue of mass incarceration in this country. We are concerned about the welfare of the humanities, and yesterday there was some talk about high-risk research and how important it is for our nation and the careers of young scientists. And we've just finished a major report on that subject, which has been adopted by the White House and is part of planning for future financing of science. And now we turn our attention to equally complex, although somewhat less visible, problem for those in the humanities and the job shortages and problematic career tracks of young humanists. Our work is advanced. Unlike many think tanks, we don't have a standing staff of experts. Our work is advanced by the selected groups of the 4,000 members and other experts who work together on these problems. And this conference, for example, draws upon almost 95% members of the Academy who are grappling with both their own history and its impact and what is the public good of this technology. The conference relates closely to a study that the Academy has undertaken on the future of the internet, not the technology of it, but its social impact, and our deep concern that we understand the risk benefits even of this technology. This morning we have an impressive group of speakers to help us examine the impact of new information technology is having on books, publishing, and libraries, subjects dear to all of us in the intellectual community. I would like to thank Ed Feigenbaum for helping to organize today's program, and again, all of our panel chairs throughout the weekend. And I want to thank our host this morning, the Computer History Museum, for being such a wonderful partner, and especially John Holler, the president and CEO of the museum. And now I'd like to ask John to come forward.
Thank you, Leslie. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the museum. And for those of you who are members and who are fellows of the museum, I can say very warmly, welcome back. I want to begin by paying tribute to Leslie Berlowitz, because this is the first time we've worked together as institutions. And I've discovered something very important about Leslie, which is, I'm sure, no surprise to those of you who are fellows and members of the Academy. Leslie Berlowitz is a force of nature. Those are the fellows that are laughing in recognition, Leslie. She is a remarkable blend of intelligence and energy and good old-fashioned arm twisting and charm. And she uses all of those skills to the Academy's best advantage, and she is a great partner because of that. So thanks, Leslie, for being that great partner, and I sincerely hope this is the first of many collaborations here in Silicon Valley between our organizations. On behalf of the trustees and members of the museum, I want to bid you a formal welcome, especially those of you here who are here within the Academy. It's a privilege to have you here with us here this morning. We share many distinguished and accomplished people between us. Gordon Bell, who jointly founded our predecessor, the Computer Museum in Boston 30 years ago, was re-inducted, as many of you saw last night, as a fellow of yours. He is a trustee and a fellow here. Lynn Shustic, our chairman, is here today, and Lynn is the heart and soul of the museum's incarnation here on the West Coast. If this were Washington, where I spent more than a decade, Lynn and his wife Donna Dubinsky would be known as a power couple. But to us out here, they are simply Lynn and Donna, and they join me with the other trustees in welcoming you. As you came in this morning, I hope you observed the wall just outside the auditorium, which is filled with the portraits of our own fellows. Not simply Gordon Bell, but others who are equally familiar to you as fellows of the Academy. Their names are very familiar: Warnock, Geschke, Hennessy, Lamson, Feigenbaum, Cerf. All among them, all of whom you will have heard from at this conference alone. There are more. These are the names and personalities and giants of technology whom we share in common, and this is another bond between us as institutions. We're the largest museum of our kind in the world. We collect. We have 60,000 artifacts, and the collection grows every day. We exhibit. That wonderful Babbage engine down in the lobby area is one great example. We teach. We've just finished our first resident scholar program. We have programs for middle school and high school students, and we host lots and lots and lots of events like this. About 10 days ago, a coalition of executives from some of the world's leading network security companies were here for dinner, and they asked me to say a few words to them just before they started their evening social hour. And I started by asking them what words they would use to describe the current mood of their customers, and indeed of their colleagues and their families. Some said uncertainty. Some said they were tightening their belts. But I have to say that the overwhelming majority used the word fear. Fear of the economy, fear of job loss, fear of losses in their companies, fear of the outright unknown. An argument can be made, in fact, that fear is in some corners of this country and in some corners of the world the predominant feature of the day. It is certainly a steady drumbeat in the news that we hear every morning. And while we might not all feel it as an element of our personal lives, I felt they were nevertheless pretty representative of the prevailing sentiment. I said to them on that night that I have come in my 7 months here as the CEO so far to think of this museum as a kind of fear-free zone. I say this not because we don't share that prevailing sentiment, because we do. I say it not because we don't fear the impact of the downturn on our finances, because we do. In fact, we're operating under what one of our trustees has called a bias toward paranoia. But if you look at that wall outside and you take a tour of the machines and the computing devices downstairs after today's session, you can't help but get an overwhelming sense of the power of innovation and imagination to solve problems like the problems we face today. The men and women in technology represented here have continuously confronted the unknown and solved the seemingly insoluble, and they have mastered it again and again. They have done so with intelligence, with good humor, with grace, and with a certain amount of humility, always reflected in phrases explaining their breakthroughs as dumb luck. Those qualities saw them through the solutions of the seemingly intractable problems of the last half-century, and perhaps they are the qualities that have always seen us through. Perhaps they're the qualities which will see us through today. In any event, I certainly feel they're the qualities that are on regular display here at the museum on a daily basis. So what we try to do is tell the story of computing not as what happened, but what mattered. We have a large and dedicated group of volunteers. We have this great collection. We have a large oral history program that has captured the personal stories of over 300 innovators so far. We're about to break ground on a 25,000 square foot exhibit that will tell the comprehensive and sweeping story of computing beginning next year. We lovingly call it Computer History, the First 2,000 Years. In that exhibit, we will interpret a huge amount of what has happened in technology, and we will attempt to identify on an ongoing basis what mattered. For every square foot of physical exhibitry, we will have the digital equivalent of many hundreds of square feet of information on the internet. It will transform this museum into an even bigger destination in Silicon Valley, I'm quite convinced. So what we have been talking about for the last day within this convention of the Academy is an inherently optimistic story. It's the story of relentless and successful problem solving, the confrontation of problems often thought to be well beyond our reach, and yet problems we've seen again and again are soluble by ingenuity, by innovation, and by hard work. If these are some of the principles that have always seen us through difficult times in the past, then we're happy to celebrate them here at the museum and to have them be a central feature of the panel this morning. Some may call that Pollyanna, but I simply call it doing the mission of the museum, which is to examine and tell the story of computing and its ongoing impact on the human experience. So for these reasons, because you're such partners in that effort as fellows in the Academy, we're happy to welcome you here this morning and to apply some of that spirit to the discussion at hand. It's now my pleasure to welcome one of our favorite trustees, a fellow of the Academy and the moderator of this panel, Ed Feigenbaum, who will begin this morning. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you all for coming. The audience is full, and that's fantastic on a Sunday morning. Starting off this panel on the future of the book publishing, and libraries, I just wanted to mention the two special contributions. One is to the person who suggested the idea of having this panel in the first place, and that's Penny Nee, when she was a board member of the San Francisco Center for the Book. She's sitting back there. And Leslie Berlowitz, who really made it happen. I agree about the force of nature. You tell Leslie about something and she wants to do it, it happens. And so that's why you're all here. Let me repeat the title because I wanted to emphasize something. The future of the book and its stakeholders. Its stakeholders are represented here by members of the publishing community, also directors of famous libraries, and of course, a major stakeholder, the authors. And you all represent the authors. Almost everyone in the audience has authored some kind of a book that has gone through the publishing process. Therefore, you have a role to play, and when we get to the time when it's your role to play, I hope you'll ask great questions or make great comments. I actually am not as severe as Leslie is on the question mark thing at the end, so please feel free to make a comment. Now, what is my role? Number one, I'm going to introduce the panelists. In fact, I'm going to ask them to come up right now so I can introduce them. And secondly, you heard a term yesterday in discussing film, the term storyboard. I'd like to just open with the storyboard. We have a storyboard, and you ought to know what it is. As you see, our panelists are Dan Clancy, who is the chief technologist of Google Books and played a central role in that much discussed settlement between the authors, publishers, and Google. John Warnock, whose name was mentioned often yesterday, co-founder of Adobe, famous rare book collector, and now an entrepreneur in the space of the electronic distribution of books, journals, and other electronic materials. John Holler is here not representing the Computer History Museum. So that's why that's second. He's here as a former senior executive of the world's largest book publishing conglomerate, Pearson, headquartered in London. In fact, we got John from London when the board hired John to the museum. So he's here representing the publishing community. And then we have two librarians. One of the librarians, Mike Keller, is the head of the Stanford libraries. I say libraries because there are many on campus, but he's also a publisher. He's director of the Stanford University Press, and he's also head of one of the largest journal publishers in the world, Highwire Press, and probably maybe the most innovative of the journal publishers. So Mike really has a dual role in representing constituencies. Don Lindberg is director of the National Library of Medicine. That's a library in Bethesda, Maryland that you've all accessed, of course, when you're looking up medical information, but it's a library that I regard as, it's not only the largest electronic library in the world, but it's a superb library. And so Don is here to represent what it takes to build such a library and where we might be going with such libraries. And finally, Daniel Goroff is the program, he's not on the slide here because he was a late addition to the program. He's the program director for economics of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And he will form closure in this panel on the question of the future of the book and the public good. Let me give you my storyboard. I'm going to show you an exponential curve. Of course, people in the audience, those of you who were science and engineering students know this curve very well. Other people use the term exponential without quite knowing how steep an exponential curve can be. So that's why I just wanted to briefly show that curve. Let me just put some calibration on that. For example, in the first year that the first browser that was made available to the public, Mosaic, came out, there was less than 1,000 users in January, and there were more than 1 million users in December. So that's pretty exponential. I could have gotten from Dan the exact number of clicks, but the clicks on Google search are just the ordinary search box have been exponential for several years. Dan can even give us the numbers. What's the latest number? How many clicks per year? 30 billion?
I don't know. I really don't.
Okay, now here's the exponential in action. I call it the Kodak train wreck. The digital revolution meets film. We heard about this yesterday. The digital revolution meets many things in train wrecks. A couple days ago, I printed out the Eastman Kodak share price. I just took an arbitrary 10-year period from 1999 to 2009 and look at the Kodak share price. In 2001, the National Geographic would not accept any photograph that was not on film. In 2008, it would not accept any photograph that was not digital. Now, the interesting thing is Kodak knew all about this. They pioneered the digital camera in 1986, but they had no way of turning around their culture. Now, then I decided to do a little research by asking people. So I went and had dinner with some Stanford students. I just volunteered to go have dinner at one of their residences. And I raised the question, what about the future of the book? And there's a Stanford junior, smart as anything, and he says, why is that interesting? Why should we care? I talked to a friend of mine who's 13-year-old, just spent $300 to buy a Sony e-book reader with his own money, the largest purchase of his life. And then I called up a friend of mine who's the agent who handled a couple of my books in New York, an important literary agent, and his curt answer in the email was, nobody knows. Now, let me give you some more quotes as I move over to the book publishers. This is an event that happened in New York. It was Don Lamb, the CEO, former CEO of W.W. Norton, which is the last of the independent book publishers that haven't sold themselves to someone else. His message to the PEN audience, PEN is an authors group, was, you folks have got to hire your own copy editors. You've probably seen that 2 or 3 times in the New York Times in the last few weeks, the similar message going out from the publishers. Pamela McCorduck, a co-author of mine and a good friend, and a former author of PEN, said, I am my own typesetter. I've been that for 10 years. I'm my own proofreader. I'm my own publicist, because your marketing people aren't very good. And now my own copy editor? What do we need you for? And indeed, the growth of the print-on-demand self-publishing firms is evidence of the fact that people are moving into that space with their publishing. Now, how about this? A brand new idea comes out of Japan. The cell phone novel. Now, why was that recognized as something interesting enough to published in the New Yorker about 6 weeks ago in a long article, because the first of the cell phone novels had the largest first-year sales of any fiction book in Japanese history. Currently, well, at least at 6 weeks ago in the New Yorker, it was 2.9 million copies. Now it's surely over 3 million copies. There are 90 such books for sale. The second, the one that's being numbers sold second was 2.4 million. But in addition to those being sold, there are thousands of other cell phone novels being written by other people with the help of a site that was put up for free to help people write cell phone novels. And the people on the trains in Japan read the novels streamed to their cell phone. Well, I'm not saying that's the future of the book. This is just a new idea that's come up. Finally, libraries. When you talk to Mike Keller, for example, he tells us that Stanford is going to have a searchable digital repository, and he collaborates quite closely with Dan in the Google Book Project. Now, let me tell you about the value of search in these libraries. About 20 years ago, I was on the Board of Trustees of the National Library of Medicine and heard a story from Don Lindbergh. Don is a master of getting money from the Congress, and he actually used this in congressional testimony. There was, Don can tell the story better than I can, but I'll just tell it briefly. There was a boy who had a problem that couldn't be diagnosed. Many doctors couldn't diagnose what was wrong with this kid. His presenting symptom was a numb chin. This was way before Google, but the National Library of Medicine had a very good search function over their millions of articles. They typed in numb chin, out came an article that explained the disease and I think maybe led to a therapy. Is that right, Don? So Congress was impressed. Now, in the growth of search, of course, I was mentioning before that Google's number of clicks in the search box is exponential. So that means the public is using search to find its way around the huge mass of information. Now I'm going to, so that's our storyline. I'm going to start the panel off by asking a fellow technologist, a fellow artificial intelligence scientist, Dan Clancy, to speak about not only his view about the future of the book, but his view from the center of the Google episode with books, authors, and publishers.
First of all, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And I want to point out, so Ed has, I guess, the book he's reading now up here. I guess in case he gets bored with what we're saying, he can page through.
No, I actually brought it for a particular reason. I'm going to quote the last paragraph of one of the more recent books by the Pulitzer Prize winner, Michael Chabon. Last night, I went to search for my electronic version of the quote, and I couldn't find it. And I said, well... So I said, why the hell should I care? I actually have the book.
Which is good, because I was going to say, I have the latest book that I've been reading right in here, and I guess I could read it, too, if I... So let me jump in. I'm going to start by looking at the question, and I'm going to talk some about what Google's doing in the settlement, but I want to start with the question about the future of books, publishing, and libraries. And I want to reframe the question, because so often when we ask these questions, we get situated in the embodiment of things today, as opposed to what the underlying purpose of these things and why they were created. And then you really need to look at the functional role and say, what's happening there, okay? And where are we missing something? So I'll call a book as a set of ideas, stories, opinions, scholarship, and some way to communicate these things, okay? So that's what a book is. Publishers, what do? They help in distribution, they help in promotion, they help in selection. And then libraries, they help in access, they help in discovery, and they help in preservation. So what is the future of ideas and stories and opinions and the distribution and promotion of those ideas and the access, discovery, and preservation of those ideas? Well, I think almost anyone would say wow, we're incredibly healthy, okay? Whereas before, you know, you had to be, if you go back, you know, 200 years, only a very select few actually got to communicate their ideas to the mass public. Of course, that was much better 30, 40, even 50 years ago, but now anyone who has an idea can communicate that idea to anyone and everyone they want, okay? Now, in terms of publishing, the friction or the cost of communication of ideas and distribution of ideas has come down radically, okay? And so now you no longer have to, you know, as Ed was pointing out in some cases, you don't have to have a publisher. And then also in terms of trying to figure out what's good, we of course have this mass movement about people deciding what's good, okay? And now we all know that there are lots of problems with that and we have to be cautious of it, et cetera, et cetera. However, we also know the idea of some small priesthood deciding which ideas are good and which ideas aren't good also isn't ideal, that really what you want is a blend. And I think what we have today is a blend. You still have authorities. You still, I personally believe there still will be a very vibrant role for publishers. Their profits may not be the same as it was in the past, okay? It may have to structure the business differently. But I think there's still going to be roles for intermediaries that help with the selection of those ideas. So part of what I think is now it's anyone can create, publish, and distribute, and everyone can help organize and discover. Now I want to highlight, I think there is a role here that absolutely is not being addressed, and I want to pick out of all of this the part that I don't think is healthy, and I think we have some serious challenges on, and that's preservation. The preservation of these ideas, people in the past often would pay for access. A library would buy a book so that it could have its patrons consume it, and then libraries also said, my role is to preserve that book. The nice thing about a book is, you know, as Mike will tell us, yes, you need to make sure the room is, you know, environmentally, you know, good and all that, but, you know, in their high density storage, you put it in a box and you put it up there, and as long as you take care of the building, it's still there 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now. And we all know, as this building attests for us, that that is not the case for bits, that you can't just put them somewhere and, oh, they'll be there in 30 years, so I don't have to worry about them. And I think as you start getting such a distributed form of communication, okay, I think there's a real challenge with preservation, as many people have said, and I actually don't see the solutions, because now, as you look forward, as people are consuming the books digitally, or things may only be born in a digital form, whose job is it to preserve that? And of course, the libraries are playing a role here, but it's a challenging job, especially because the cost for preservation can be high. So in terms of the health, I'm going to challenge that that's an area where we still have lots of challenges. Now, there's certainly, you know, when you talk about book, there's lots of discussion about people maybe not reading as in-depth as they used to read, okay? And that it used to be that you'd sit down with a book and you'd read the whole thing and you'd think deeply. And now that kids today are kind of just reading a little bit of everything. And I actually have some sympathy for that. I think that may be true. Whether or not that's a bad thing, I don't know exactly. We used to always celebrate a Renaissance man as someone who knew about a lot of different things. And it's certainly the case that in today's day and age, you have kids that are kind of, you know, learning a lot about a lot of different things. And I think that's less a question about the book and publishing and more a question about intellectual discourse and the degree to which that in today's you know, internet media age, are we training our kids to think deeply, or are we training our kids to kind of go shallowly? And I think that's an interesting question for discussion. Now what I want to get to, I want to kind of talk more broadly about the challenge and then talk a little bit about what Google you know, has been doing in this space and why we got into it, and a little bit about the agreement we recently reached. So when we started this project 5 years ago or so, the purpose of it was discovery. It was strongly believed, as actually the example gave about the medical example, that full-text search has revolutionized the way people could find information. And of course, I remember when I was an undergrad and a graduate student where I would go to the library and I would get a stack of books this big, and I actually would spend as much time finding the books as I would actually reading them, sometimes more, because I would be just in wonder of all the great things I could do for this wonderful report. But then by the time I actually had collected them all and got back to my dorm room, I only had like 3 hours to actually write the report and actually consume it. And so I think this fascination with reading a little bit about a lot of things even happened before. strongly believe that in the internet, full text search had really helped people discover stuff that previously hadn't been there and that it was still in its infancy, and that there is this vast array of offline information that was highly valuable, and that people should be able to discover that through full text search. Larry and Sergey actually had thought about the project when they were at Stanford, and the ambition really was to index all the world's books, and the point was to help people find them. Now, more recently, of course, there's been a settlement agreement to a lawsuit. And first of all, since almost all of your class members, I should mention that I'm communicating more generally, and all of you should find out information about the agreement through your counsel, there's a website that I can tell you about if you want to know. But I'm not promoting or anything. I was the plaintiff. So, this was something that we spent a long time in discussion with authors and publishers and libraries. And what we were really trying to do was take this one area of disagreement, where there was a disagreement over whether or not what we were doing was allowed under US law, and really create something that was a win-win for all the parties, okay? And most importantly, from my perspective, also a win for users, because while I've always believed in the value of full-text search, I also realize that I do full-text search and I see what we had been doing for in-copyright books, where we didn't have rights, 3 little what we call snippets, like you ripped out the piece of paper. And granted, while I love the project I'm building and all, I personally just find it really hard to use those 3 little snippets to find out if this is the right book for me. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is let someone figure out, is this the right book for me, so then they can go get the book. And the snippets didn't do that, okay? So while I thought it was great, I still felt it had a long way to go. And as I would think of the world that we were hoping to create, I've always, dreamed of or thought that we would live in a world, say 10, 15, 20 years from now, where hopefully my son, when he goes to college, can access all the world's books, okay? And that he can actually get all the information that he wants at his fingertips. And this de facto wasn't happening independent of something like this, because there are so many parties and the law is so complex here. So what the agreement basically does is fairly simple. It says, listen, for rights holders, there are various different ways to provide access to the book. If it's out of print, the default is let's provide access. If it's in print, we don't let anyone gain access. And one way is consumer purchase online. Another way is an institutional subscription for libraries. Another way is a preview, where everyone gets free preview of the book, so they can kind of assess whether or not the book meets their needs or not. So in the agreement, again, I'm just going very quick here because I think we have a lot of other interesting things to talk about here. What it does is now it's part of a broader movement, and I should mention, there are lots of other digitization efforts. There's the OCA, there's Europeana, a number of other activities. Lots of libraries do digitization. It's helping us bring us to an age where some of the benefit that we saw in publishing of new ideas also accrues to the access and discovery of older ideas. Because one way you can think about this is publishers are the throttle who are figuring out what new ideas we get. Libraries are the vehicle by which we've always accessed ideas that have already been there, books that have already been there. And the revolution of the internet and technology hasn't necessarily made it as easy to get to those 30 million books as we might like. And now hopefully this is part of a broader movement, so that my kids and my kids' kids, when they're doing scholarship, they aren't just looking at what's popular and what's online and all that, but they're really looking at all the world's information, can go back to original sources and really dig deeply in that. And with that, I'm done.
So I'm going to follow up on a lot of ideas that Dan discussed. And as Ed mentioned, I'm doing this not as a museum person, but as someone who spent 8 years working for Pearson in London, and who before that was in charge of the internet group at PBS, among other things. So I've spent the last 15 years looking at the intersection of digital media, print media, and the future of the user. But the topic this morning obviously is the future of the book. And since I'm supposed to be speaking from the perspective of the publishers, notice the penguin orange tie that I'm wearing this morning, I'm going to talk about something we spent a lot of time talking about at Pearson, which was not necessarily the future of the book, but the reader of the future. Because as Dan suggested, and as we heard yesterday, these two things are intractably linked, and they're now making rather savage changes in the way that publishing works. We worried at Pearson a lot about two tipping points. The first, which we heard a lot about yesterday and which Dan has just touched on, is the area of distribution and the very rapid transition that is happening from paper to screens. Ed gave some of these statistics a minute ago. I just want to put a number up here on the screen. Anyone want to guess what this number is? This is the average daily circulation of the New York Times in its paper form nationwide, 1,077,000. Now, I'm going to ask for a guess when I put the next number up. How many Facebook accounts are now used on a daily basis? Not the total number of Facebook users, but the number of Facebook accounts used on a daily basis. Any guesses?
50.
70 million? 75 million. How many Facebook accounts were added to Facebook from December 10th to January 15th? 20 million. So this rather savage tipping point of paper to screens has been passed, and it's of course a very big concern for publishers. Now, why is this happening? I want to give you just a couple more data points. This is from the Pew Internet Project, which is producing some of the best data, I think, on internet usage now. You can see the percentage of all Americans with broadband internet access at home. It took us about 10 years to get to the blue bars. The hashed blue bars above that are the period from 2005 to 2008. So 10 years below, 4 years above, and you can see how evenly distributed it is and how rapidly it's grown in that very short period of time. With the effect really being that almost everybody is online now. And when you look at the far left end, which is what I'm talking about this morning, the reader of the future, really everybody is online. There's only a very fractional, very small number of people between the ages of 12 and 24 who aren't online in this country now. And most of them are getting broadband access. So that the average living room at home, as pictured by the New York Times back in July, tends to look like this. So the big question is, and this is something that Dan referred to online, are you really reading? What are you doing if you're the reader of the future? Are you really reading when you're online? Well, this guy thinks you are. That's Jeff Bezos, the old Kindle on the left, the new Kindle on the right. We saw a Kindle yesterday. Dave Clark had one. They're incredibly beautiful, incredibly thin, incredibly flexible. So there's the distribution. There's a Kindle right there. Hold that up. Would you stand up? Stand up. Turn it sideways. Have you seen a Kindle? This is the Kindle. This is a Kindle 2. Right? There's another one. They're breaking out everywhere.
I've already read 5 books on it.
5 books since Tuesday. Did you read fewer books before you had the Kindle? Okay, all right. So this is a distribution thing for you. You've gone from print to screen. Okay, so that's the paper to screen tipping point. That's tipping point number 1 for distribution. The second tipping point is this collision now between the owners of distribution and the content that they're trying to get out there. We heard a lot about this. This format is in trouble. This particular business may or may not be in trouble depending on who you decide to believe. This is how it looks on the device you just saw held up. And these are the economics. So read that headline. Printing the New York Times now costs twice as much as sending every subscriber a free Kindle. And if you read down through the text, you do find out that if you took the 830,000 readers that a Times spokesman identified and you spent $359 to send them a Kindle, that would cost $297 million, and it costs $644 million to print the New York Times every year. So that's how this content distribution collision is beginning to play out for publishers. But it could also be on this, as Dan just showed. This is the little scroll motion program, which is very beautiful for your iPhone. So who is this and why is she smiling? This is Marjorie Scardino, who is the chief executive of Pearson, my old boss. And she's smiling because she has taken 3 enormously prestigious and sizable businesses and over the last 10 years very relentlessly begun to drive Pearson toward this world of digital content and media unhinged increasingly from the print companies that are the legacy companies she owns. Pearson Education at the bottom is the largest education publisher in the world by a factor of more than 2, and you recognize the other big brands. So who's this man and why is he not smiling? He's not smiling, and many publishers like him are not smiling because they have not been as relentless and as focused on this collision between content and distribution. Now, I don't mean to pick on Rupert Murdoch, but I will point out that he did just write down half of the value, half of the cost that he just paid for this newspaper in the last quarter, and has a lot of businesses like Marjorie has on the left, and they're working very hard, as is Random House, as is Bertelsmann, as is all the publishers, to try to figure out how this is going to happen. Now, I want to begin to wrap this up by just giving you a quote from Marjorie. This is from January, but people who work at Pearson have been hearing this for many, many years from Marjorie. So here it is. Content is mostly generic, particularly in education. Now, just think about that for a minute. This is the CEO of one of the world's largest and most powerful publishing companies standing up at the SIIA conference in January saying content is mostly generic. So that means if you have designs on publishing the next great physics textbook, chances are she may not be the best publisher for you. Because there are only a few ways you can describe photosynthesis. There's nothing unique about that or history lessons. But she went on to say, and this is the direction she's moving and the whole and she's moving the publishing industry in this direction. I definitely believe it. It's only the way you impart that information that's different. So we try to figure out how the content and student or reader are interacting, and only embedded technology can do that. So this is the publisher of the future, I think, thinking about the reader of the future. So if you ask Marjorie online, are you really reading? I think she'd say, well, you have to answer that not only thinking about the reader and the writer of the future, so meet the writer of the future. Nadia Koenig from Cleveland. She was featured in the New York Times last July. Time spent reading books outside class, 0. Hours spent reading online per night, 6. And the Times went on in great detail about the places she spends doing her reading. And isn't it interesting that she expects to major in English in college and her ambition is to write books? So if you asked her if you're really reading online, she might say, well, I might write here, and I might write here, or I might just give you a smile.
John Warnock is going to talk next.
I'm going to talk on a little broader about media in general. Over the past 7 years, since I retired as CEO of Adobe, I've been interested in what is going to happen to all these companies that have traditionally provided media to the world. And so I sort of consciously joined a bunch of boards that might help answer that question. So for about 3.5 years, I was on the board of directors of Knight Ridder Newspapers, who own 22 newspapers, including the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Miami Herald, San Jose Mercury News. And that was really interesting, before they were acquired by McClatchy. I've been a member of the Board of Trustees of the American Film Institute and the Sundance Institute for a number of years, and this gives you a view into the two halves of the film world. One half of the film world is big studio films, Warner Brothers, Sony, people like that. The Sundance Institute gives you a look into the documentary world and the independent film world. That's been very interesting. I'm chairman of an online magazine called Salon Media Group, which is also interesting because that has a completely different dynamic than the normal news distribution. I'm on the board of directors of my son's company, which is eBury, which provides about, well, actually about 250,000 titles in about 100 countries to college libraries and academic libraries. That's very interesting because it has a very, very different dynamic for providing electronic books than sort of through the normal commercial means. I started a company called Octavo that did high-quality digitization. That didn't work out very well, so now there's one employee of Octavo, and I have a site called rarebookroom.org, and the only employee is me. So this has been an interesting journey, and I'd like to talk about sort of three parts of it. Newspapers, film, and books. Yesterday, newspapers came up, and being on the board of Knight Ridder during its decline was fascinating. From a timeline point of view, the problems with the newspapers started when the internet bubble burst, and the internet bubble bursting wasn't cause of that. It was just the time event where this started to happen. Obviously, things like Craigslist started erosion of classified ads, and the the advent of online advertising started decline of national ads. Declining circulation. I pointed out, I asked the Knight Ridder board when I first joined, I said, well, are you in the communication business or are you really in the newspaper business? And they wouldn't answer that question. But the reality was they were in the newspaper business. And they really didn't have the mentality to think of how to change their infrastructure to the communication business, because so much of their economics is about producing the newspaper. There's so much having to do with owning pulp plants, paper manufacturing, newsprint consumption, huge presses that have enormous capital intensity to them. They were in the newspaper business. And so they did all kinds of studies about why circulation was declining and how they could change that. And I said, look, guys, none of my kids take a newspaper. And your demographics of your readership is sort of increasing year by year, sort of as people get older, that's your population, and that population is eventually going to disappear. The methodology or the modality of reading from a newspaper as opposed to online, I said, you can't be serious to believe that you think people in the future are going to wait 24 hours to get the news. They're going to go to online and get the news that way. The one advantage they did have, so the large papers were hit first. The Philadelphia Inquirer, the Miami Herald, and the San Jose Mercury News started to lose readership because they didn't have enough of a local impact to hold their readership. Now, small papers in the local communities had local news that wasn't being served by the internet, and so those had a more successful profile. Knight Ridder did invest digitally in streamlining their production processes, sharing content, and the fastest part of their business was their digital investment, and it was called Knight Ridder Digital. They got into the classifieds with careerbuilder.com, and they did that with Gannett and with the Tribune companies, and that was competing with monster.com, and so there was a bright spot in the digital future. When McClatchy bought them, McClatchy was a very traditional newspaper company, and they were not interested in the digital aspects of Knight Ridder. So that got canceled. The person who ran it at Knight Ridder is now Senior Vice President at Yahoo. So this is the most depressing slide in the world. This is the 5-year stock prices of McClatchy, New York Times, and Gannett. And you can sort of ignore the last little segment where everybody's stock price died. So, but you can see it's down 90%. So the reality is, I think the observation that the New York Times could give everybody a Kindle for the cost of producing the newspapers, the economics aren't there. And the economics aren't there because you have to produce something physical, you have to distribute it, and it's not in the cards. It can't compete with electronic distribution. The other thing is that if you advertise it in a newspaper, you have no idea whether anyone ever reads that advertisement. You have no idea about the demographics of whether the ad was effective or not. If you buy a Google ad, you know exactly what the demographics of the ad is and how effective it is and how effective you are at reaching the customer. These two facts say that this aspect of publishing, I'm afraid, are going to be gone. Now, newspapers will exist in small segments, but it won't be like it is today. There are two parts to the film industry. This is also a train wreck. There are big studios, and then they're independent. And the problem is the number of films getting produced is going up like crazy, and the number getting distributed are going down like crazy. Now, there was positive news in the New York Times this morning that people are going back to theaters, and that's sort of may have something to do with economic conditions, but that might be a short-term blip in the film industry. Film distribution, it's interesting, the amount of revenue a film makes that from theatrical distribution is essentially 15% of the revenue. So theatrical distribution is going to become a less important part of the film business. Books. So there's a war. The war between the publishers, the distributors, and the authors. Distribution believes it should own the distribution of books. Publishers believe they should own the distribution of books. And all of that is changing. There's a huge cost advantage for electronic publication of information. If you never go into the book form, the cost profile is wildly different than it is if you do go into book form. I think libraries have a huge opportunity in the future, and I think my son's company is an example of this, because you can organize content in ways electronically that you could never think about in a book form or in a collection of individual books. You can find information, not through simple search like Google, but in really putting content together in very unique ways, in very personal ways, in very sort of information theoretic ways that you can't in today's world. So I think the world of the electronic library is very, very positive. Cost of delivery matters, and the internet has it all over the physical media. I think as our children learn to read from the screen, that will be the first time that there's a serious challenge to paper. I mean, paper will go away as people learn initially to read off of the screen. The traditional media companies are generally capital intensive. The world of the internet is not capital intensive. It is very hard for companies to change business models. You can't ask a company like Knight Ridder, that's a $3.5 billion company, or the New York Times, which is huge, to become a $100 million company. And that's essentially what is going to happen for to be success in the information distribution age. Anyway, thank you.
So now our story moves to a person who's not only a librarian, but also a publisher.
So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on publishing and a little bit of time on libraries, but let me tell you that at Stanford we are in the middle of a grand transition, one that I thought would be over 5 years ago, but it turns out it's not over yet. We have a whole group of faculty, principally in the sciences, technology, and medicine, who are ready to move to e-forms and have made that transit. And we have a vast middle ground of folks who use both e-forms and physical forms. And we have a few, perhaps 10 or 15% of the faculty, and almost none of the students, who are waiting for me to prize the book from their cold, dead hands. I thought it might be fun for us to take a look at a very rapid history of the book, just to make sure we're all understanding that what we call a book today has not always been in that format. This is Gilgamesh, one of 12 tablets about 5,000 years old, the first novel, Gilgamesh. This is the Book of Esther on a scroll that's been unwrapped in Hebrew. This is a 13th century Book of Hours. We now recognize the format. This is the handwritten holograph by John Steinbeck of Cannery Row. Is this a book? Certainly it's a book. Here's the typescript. Here are the galley proofs, and eventually comes out as a book, of course. This is the Revised Standard Edition of the Bible in the very large format Arian Press edition, obviously a book. This is a book in our collection. It's a book as art. Not a lot of words in that book, but we nevertheless have it in our special collections. This is another image of the Kindle. This one is the Kindle 2. And this is Genesis from a 19th century edition of the King James edition of the Bible. What I can't show you is the new book, and I very much agree with Marjorie Scardino in the notion that the new book is one in which there'll be embedded objects, media objects, applications, spreadsheets, you name it, extra stuff. And I think the real role of authors and publishers in this brave new world is precisely in that new narrative zone. Let me blank this out. Well, it won't blank out, so I'll just leave this up. It seems to me that we need to remember a few things about publishing, and that is that the work of good editors in selecting and making clear the author's intentions is actually valuable. And as we see more and more publishers turning to, more and more authors turning to vanity publishing because the mainstream publishers will only publish known names, we're going to see some strange emanations. Some of them will not be edited. Some of them won't make very much sense. And sorting through all of those, getting critical reviews of them is going to be a major issue. I think that the role of vanity publishing and the role of the big publishers who only take name authors is going to be well challenged. I hope will be well challenged by smaller presses like the university presses, where there's a lot of effort into selecting good titles and cultivating authors. I agree entirely with John Warnock that electronic distribution is the way. Perhaps for some who are still desiring to caress the pages as they turn them, print on demand of the old passive form is possible. However, in the electronic world, the terrible aspect of the book publishing business, which is the ability of booksellers to return the book without having paid for it, will go away, and that will help us an awful lot. Now, turning to libraries, I want to point out that over the last centuries, libraries have been involved in expanding access beyond the local collection. Google is, and the Google Books program is one of several that's intended and actually achieving the very broadest distribution possible. But remember that interlibrary loan, union catalogs, the big bibliographic utility OCLC, various document delivery services, the delivery of e-books and e-journals. eBury has been mentioned. I'll mention Highwire Press too for journals. Local digitization of content such as the Library of Congress American Memory Program and the Matthew Parker Online Library. And then mass digitization has come along. So we need to look at the continuum of what libraries have been up to, often with partners and now proudly with Google, among others. What are the functions that libraries perform, and will they go away? Well, first there's selection and acquisition of titles of all kinds, of all genres. We provide intellectual access through metadata cataloging of one kind or another, abstracting and indexing. We try to find facts. We try to interpret a book or a collection of books. We provide instruction in information literacy, information heuristic. We often provide a kind of translating function between disciplines or among disciplines who don't share jargon but actually are sharing ideas. We distribute books through circulation of one kind or another and now through licensing e-versions. And most importantly, as Dan has pointed out, we preserve things, lots of things in lots of ways. And now we are getting to the matter of digital preservation, a vast uncharted sea and lots of experimentation to come. And we help students and faculty analyze, manipulate, and present, whether the content is analog or digital. Libraries are also places, and despite the rise of the use of digital resources and the incredible penetration of the digital world among the younger among us, libraries are still heavily used. They're used to house physical objects which haven't yet been digitized. They house readers and staff. They're clean, well-lit places. They are comfortable places. They promote study by individuals and by groups. They promote social exchange. They are places where people know they can get help in this one zone of intellectual exploration. They are homes to exhibits. We try to excite the mind. However, when you think of libraries not as buildings to keep the birds and the bees away from the books and keep the rain off the readers, you've got some other issues to confront, and that is, I think, described best as libraries as collections. When you have a physical collection, you have a problem. The laws of physics apply. Only one person can use one resource at a time. When you have a digital object that contains some knowledge or information, you can have many readers read the same thing simultaneously, and they can read it anywhere. Big benefit. We can provide access to media objects and digital objects of all kinds very broadly, and that's been the big message of the internet. It really has democratized learning and intellectual exploration. I think that the role of libraries in special collections in the next decade will be incredibly important, and I expect us to become more dependent on the vast collections that are being assembled at Google and smaller collections by the Open Content Alliance and the Million Books Project. So I think that the place for us to be very helpful will be in the generation of special collections, meaning personal and corporate archives, rare book collections, map collections, and the like. Finally, there's an interesting problem that we have developed over the centuries where we use certain kinds of cataloging and descriptive rules for different genres of material. And that means that you have to know all the rules and have to know all the places to look. And I think we now have an opportunity to change that and to get on with paying attention to the actual content and the ideas and expressions, not to the format or the genre of the information object. So what are going to be the new services provided by libraries in the 21st century? Well, first of all, I think the very fact of keyword searching is making a big difference. But I also think we've got to develop virtual browsing, and that has to be permitted across all genres. I think we're going to see some specialized indexing and searching, among them semantic searching, taxonomic indices, and associative searching. I think the use of graphical user interfaces to navigate complicated information topography is going to be quite interesting. Text and data mining, natural language processing will develop a whole new set of findings and some new possibilities. I think hyperlinking explicit and implicit references is quite important. I think that alerting and recommendations will be very helpful as we get a larger and larger universe of knowledge in front of our faces. With regard to the digital archive, only several points. First of all, it's important that we have a spread out, a distributed system of digital archiving, as we have a distributed system of physical archiving. We in the not-for-profit library and museum worlds are hedges against loss. We need larger and more searchable collections of unica in the form of personal and corporate archives. The digital archives can provide that. We need to provide opportunities for self-archiving and annotation to people like Ed, who's helping us with our self-archiving legacy tool. And we need to find ways of making more easy the linking of related material regardless of locations. I wonder if we're not making progress toward Gordon Dixon's final encyclopedia. Finally, thank you.
Don Lindberg, I would say Mr. Electronic Library, except he's an MD, so he's Dr. Electronic Library.
Well, Ed, thank you for the invitation to be here. Ed told me I could only show 2 slides, so I decided I better not show any. But this group has wisely separated the future of the book from concern with libraries and publishing, so I won't stress that. But the other side of the relationship, it seems to me, namely the reader, deserves much thought. One sees, at least I'd see, a growing appreciation of the talents of readers or would-be readers for learning in individualized and widely different ways. We're just now seeing the chance to ask, might different kinds of books suit quite different kinds of readers? What different kinds of readers ought we to consider? Some of this you'll be familiar with, but I'll say it anyway. Tom West in The Mind's Eye suggests that readers who are good at words and numbers are different from those he calls visual learners. In his view, the latter may include persons with learning disabilities or dyslexia. He suggests further that a number of great scholars and scientists of the past were in fact learning disabled and simultaneously were visual learners and brilliant visual thinkers. So he gives as an example Albert Einstein, Michael Faraday, Thomas Edison, pretty convincingly. From modern times, he points to success in visualization of statistical relationships by Carl Pearson. Now, Pearson was not a numbers guy. Pearson was a geometry guy. So for dyslexics and successful in business, West cites and quotes Charles Schwab. So there's a series of these. If these persons, I'm going to suggest, if these persons could not easily learn and understand mathematical relationships from words and equations printed on book pages, should we not imagine, indeed seek, a better way? Of course, a full discussion here would give due credit to Howard Gardner, but you don't have the time. What different kinds of books might one wish to see? First, I have to say that I have every intention of keeping every single book I've ever owned and loved, and if I die just reading one in front of a roaring fire in the fireplace, I'll be happy. But, and the libraries, I think Mike really described very, very well, but I'll skip that too, and go to the books, because that's what you asked me to talk about. I recall very well an occasion some years ago when I heard Ed Feigenbaum speak hypothetically from a future time about a hypothetical time in the past, quote, when the books could not speak to each other. Was this, I wonder, merely another charming Feigenbaum bon mot, or are we already observing books talking to each other? And I think it is the case that we are. Even though still on the shelf or even still in the print-on-demand queue, a book which one approaches via a web search certainly seems to have struck up an acquaintance with similar books and books that previous readers bought, even country cousin book copies that are for sale used. Medical books on the shelf at National Library of Medicine, PubMed and PubMed Central, that is to say electronic books, bristle with links to people who have written them, read them, cited them, and in the case of journal articles have disagreed with them, inspired letters to the editor or editorials, or damned their conclusions. There's a lot. And if you listen closely, there's a din of books talking to each other. They're really pretty rattly. So this is a logical extension of librarians' work in the past. After all, librarians invented the codex, the alphabetical list of titles, tables of contents, indices, quaint notations, for instance, see also from, always amused me, and quiet reading rooms. So they've done their part, but now the links to and the context have to be created in an electronic fashion. So for instance, at NLM, we're certainly librarians, but I guess in a certain sense we're kind of in the publishing business too, because the scientific databases aren't at all accessible or useful unless they're accessed through a computer system. I mean, there's 250 billion nucleotides in GenBank. I mean, if we printed them, it wouldn't do much good. And even just plain the Medline journal articles is 15 million. You have to have a computer help you get through that. So with all this, these pieces of progress in mind, what kind of book do we need now? And I think, of course, as others have said, we want an interactive one. For this to happen, we need interactive publishing. And I'm interested in this. I'm confident this day is, in fact, already dawning. A study at the NLM 2 years ago supports this assertion. We looked at 368 journal issues with 13,500 articles in biomedical journals that we subscribe to and already index. So of those, 258, which is about 2%, were really already interactive. That is, they already included interactive content that is video, audio, animation, plots, or table building. Some are merely multimedia, but some are really, really interactive. So what does that mean, and what kind of interactivity will be wanted in biomedicine? I'm sticking to that area. Well, of course, we do not know the answer to those questions precisely right now, and for that reason, NLM has been seeking research partner relationships with commercial publishers. We want to know what are the true costs and benefits of interactive publishing. Beyond this, we want to learn how NLM will in the future decades fulfill its obligation to acquire, organize, preserve, and disseminate biomedical knowledge from the world for the benefit of the public health. And of course, how to do this if files for interactive publishing are found willy-nilly scattered amongst academic, commercial, private computer file servers. We can't do that, especially when we don't have really appropriate standards in place. So let me give you a few examples in lieu of my 100 interactive PowerPoints, a few cases in which point-and-click interactive publishing would obviously enhance biomedical teaching and learning and practice. So paper or textbooks that describe in words, an example, the patient's breath sounds or the sounds through a stethoscope or the beating heart need some help. Does lub-dub seem like a fully informative description? Or might one prefer a nice audio recording linked to what part of the chest you had it and what kind of patients? Or, for instance, EKG publications that only give you 3 or 4 complexes just make you say, I want the rhythm strip. I want to see that whole rhythm. Similarly, a still, 1 or 2 stills from a CAT scan, well, I mean, there's 10,000 such pictures that we really want to have access to. Or an ordinary little statistical table, a 2x2 table. Or how about the numbers that went in that table? That's what we really want to see. Somewhat more dramatically, if one looks at a description of a new surgical procedure in a print journal or book, it's very tempting to wish to point and click for a glance in the operative field. And maybe even some, follow the dots instructions, how you do that thing. And amazingly, one can already do exactly this in a few current endoscopic surgery journals that we index. I mean, if you know how to handle the equipment, in 20 minutes you can learn to do a new procedure quite well. So how will these publications evolve? That's the topic we're supposed to discuss. And I guess no surprise, they'll evolve by creative and venturesome people. There's an added expense, of course, for this interactivity. It'll be offset if we know that subscribers learn faster or remember longer, perhaps even understand more fully. And only experiments will tell us where are those breakpoints. So NLM is currently doing such an experiment with the publisher, Optical Society of America. They publish 40 or 50 journals, and we index 5 or 6 of them that are fairly medical. So we have an agreement with them whereby they are undertaking to do 4 special issues of some relevant journals, all of which will contain interactive articles. I think the first quarter is out already. They're generally high-resolution images, and the interactivity has been provided to the reader-subscriber members. So what do you think about this? So for this to work, what do you really need? Well, you need authors, first of all, that are willing to write in that way. And then you need editors willing to do all that extra work. And we need reviewers that will review the data as well as the paper. So it's quite a production. All probably worthwhile in the end if you get a better result. So I won't try to demonstrate those to you, but I will say that the features provided are ones that I would not have imagined. I've never seen used. For example, if you go across, let's say, a cross-section of a vessel, you can go to a little iconic thing, sort of in the style of Photoshop, and bring down a little measuring device. And if you want that to take the 3D volume, it'll do that. And if you display, this a sagittal section, a cross-section, horizontal section, you can lock that view for all those 3 or 4 places. So it's sort of like a missile firing thing from a fighter aircraft. You remember that from your Air Force days. And so anyway, that's what that kind of expert wants. we'll find out how much they're willing to actually invest in paying for it. I want to end by saying that there probably is to be considered federal policy in this. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, obviously, copyright has already been addressed by Dr. Clancy, but way, way beyond that, take the area of drugs and clinical trials. A paper used to be kind of something you worked carefully at, and you got through the criteria of the journal and made all the corrections, and it got published, and you could get a reprint and give it to your mother. Put it on your CV. Happy day, you know? But a paper in the Journal of American Medical Association, a New England Journal, that says this drug cures or helps depression, that is a billion-dollar paper. And people will cut a lot of corners to make that happen. The editors are very angry about it, and so the Congress required the registration of trials in '97 at NLM before the trial can be legitimized, and the editors of the top medical journals made a pledge that if they're not registered, we won't publish the results. You won't get your billion-dollar paper published if you haven't registered these things before you recruited patients. So we now have, starting from scratch, something like 47,000 such clinical trials in our registry from 100 countries. So a good idea actually prevails, even though, of course, the Congress has no authority in Europe or Asia, but it's a good thing and people do it. In 2007, Congress added a requirement to include the results within 1 year of completing the clinical trial, also at NLM. That's a lot harder to do, but we're doing that as well. So ask yourself, would it be even more helpful to link to the results when you're reading the paper, when it's actually a published peer-reviewed paper? And the answer is, of course. So we may have to figure out how to do that, and that may, in fact, be in the future. I want to end, finally, by agreeing with Dan Clancy that preservation is a big, big issue. I mean, it's not well addressed by us or anybody else. It's a serious, serious problem that maybe Leslie ought to have another meeting about. Thank you.
And our last panelist is Daniel Goroff from Harvey Mudd College and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And I want to thank Daniel for agreeing at the last minute to serve our panel to discuss the future of the book and the public good.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted and surprised to be joining this distinguished panel. But Ed and Leslie asked me just to review a few of the basics about the economics of information, public goods, and publishing. And so I'm very pleased to be doing that. But the first thing I have to say is that these are just my personal perspectives and not necessarily those of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So you may have noticed that economists always like to talk about markets. Well, at least until recently they have. So why is that? That's because their story about competitive markets always has a happy ending. Firms maximize revenue. That's what they're supposed to do for their shareholders. And they do that in the classical theory by producing at a level where the price equals the marginal cost. That's the cost of producing an extra unit of whatever it is that they're making. Given a technology, competition adjusts the number of firms so that supply equals demand at that price that's supposed to equal the marginal cost. So prices tell you everything that you need so that everyone is happy, doing what they think best for themselves without having to think about anybody else. That's the story of the invisible hand. And it guides us to an equilibrium that has a glorious property called Pareto efficiency, which means that you can't make anyone better off without making someone else worse off. So it's that kind of not wasting. So it's a great story. What could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong with this? Now we know maybe lots. But yesterday, Ed and Leslie asked me just to give a quick primer on those market failures associated with information technology and with publishing in particular. So how is an information good, like, say, an open access article on the web or a book on the web, how is that different from a traditional commodity like a loaf of bread? And what do we need to have a happy ending that efficiently benefits society if we're thinking about these kinds of information goods? So a loaf of bread is an example of a good that economists call rival. And what that means is that what I use of it diminishes the amount that anybody else can have. So if I eat the bread, that's it. And it's also excludable, and that means that it's easy for me to prevent other people from using it once I bought it. But this is in contrast, say, to a good that you might think of like a lighthouse, or a park, or a new idea, because these are neither rival nor excludable. So they're called non-rival and non-excludable. And economists therefore call these public goods. So this is a kind of commodity that have these two properties. And the provision of public goods is a natural concern for governments, and I have to say for private charities like the Sloan Foundation. And that's because in a free market, potential suppliers will find it hard to recover the costs of a public good, and so it will be produced at levels that are less than the social optimum. So if you go to your local venture capitalists and ask them to support you to build a lighthouse somewhere, you're probably not going to get very far. So information is generally considered non-rival. And unless the legal system comes into play, it's also non-excludable. So information as a commodity shares the characteristics of a public good. Now, Merton pointed out that for this reason, there would be very few incentives for producers to distribute new ideas at all, ever, if not for the system of rewarding priority that modern academia, in particular modern science, has instituted. And that also accounts for many of the winner-take-all kind of mores that we see in our profession. Other peculiar properties of information include, on the demand side, the fact that you really don't know what a given piece of information is worth until you possess it, and that the value also depends on its context, its use, its timing, and who else has that piece of information. On the supply side, information goods tend to have high fixed costs, but low or even zero incremental costs. For example, it can be very expensive to make the first recording of a new song, or the first dose of a new medicine, or the first copy of a new academic journal issue or a new book. But then the cost of making subsequent copies, is often negligible in comparison. And that's the key part from an economic point of view that the information technology revolution has really changed. That's exactly where this cost structure of high fixed costs but very low incremental costs, that comes in. And it's a natural concern then for regulators because it also inhibits competition. If several firms offer interchangeable goods, consumers will only buy the one with the lowest price. As firms bid down the price, the only floor is the incremental cost of production. But we just said that that could be very, very low. Because selling at that price will not cover the high fixed costs, producers will be forced out of business until just one of them remains. The single seller can then operate as a monopolist. In practice, what one often observes under such circumstances is monopolistic competition, in which there are a few somewhat different products in the market, some of which are close substitutes. So the automobile, the cell phone industries, maybe I don't have to remind this gathering that if you're in the business of selling operating systems for computers, that you might be in exactly that kind of a situation as well. These are all examples of monopolistic competition, and it's in contrast to the market, say, for wheat, where there are so many producers and so many buyers that people generally take prices rather than setting them. So what happens when it comes to providing public goods? What should we do about that? Well, it turns out behavioral economics is all the rage, so let's try an experiment. I want to play a little game with you. It's a social dilemma game. And all you have to do is decide whether you want to play strategy C or strategy D. Now we're going to count up how many people have chosen C and D. And let's imagine that the number of people who get Cs, who decide to be Cs, that anyone who's a D player gets that number of dollars. Okay, so if you're a D player, you are going to get a number of dollars, we're imagining, that's equal to the number of C players. If, on the other hand, you're a C player, you will get the number of dollars, which is the number of C players, minus 20. Okay, so think about that for a minute. And here's what I'd like you to do. Maybe I'll ask the panel to help me make a quick estimate of how many people vote each way. And we're going to do something that I learned as a professor. I want you to vote this way. Cover your eyes. Right? I don't want to see whatever is going on. Cover your eyes, and how many people, everybody cover your eyes. Really. How many people want to play the C strategy? Okay, hands down. How many people want to play the D strategy? Very interesting. Okay, thank you. You say roughly half and half? I would say very rough.
More Ds.
More Ds? More Ds, okay.
Two-thirds Ds.
Two-thirds Ds? Okay, so maybe a few more Ds. So let's see what happens now without voting with your eyes covered. Okay? So what we saw was that there were about two-thirds Ds. So say there are 200 people here. So let's say half. So if it were half and half, if there are two-thirds, then everybody who is a C would get...
There's 300 people here.
300 people here?
And two-thirds were Ds.
300 people here and two-thirds were Ds. Okay, so that means that all the Cs would get $100 and all the Ds would get $80. Okay? Let's vote again now that you've seen how that works. What? Oh, the other way around. I'm sorry. No. No. Okay. Right, okay. You understand what it's supposed to be. Okay, let's vote again with your eyes open. How many people want to play C? Maybe fewer. And how many people want to play D? Ooh, lots more. Okay, so in this case, the Cs are going to get even less, right? And the Ds are also going to get less. Okay, what's going on here? The Cs are generating the wealth, right? And the Ds are exploiting that, right? So they're sort of, the Cs are cooperating and the Ds are defecting. If you want to think of this as a kind of a group prisoner's dilemma problem, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, what if you were a CEO of a company and you're responsible to your shareholders? Which way would you vote then? Probably most people would vote D. It would be very hard to justify voting C otherwise, right? But what is the Pareto efficient strategy in this situation? There's only one Pareto efficient strategy, and that would be for all of us to vote C, okay? And then we would all get a very high amount of money. We'd have to sacrifice the $19 and stuff like that, but we would all get much more money than you guys were producing with your votes, eyes covered or not covered, right? So if we could somehow agree to do that, then we would all be better off by investing in C. So the kind of example I want you to think of is strategy C is like buying a membership in your local NPR station. Okay? And it's not an accident that the Sloan Foundation is concerned with supporting NPR and PBS and things like that. Or you could think of strategy C as posting your scholarly work on an open access site on the internet, and strategy D is going to a for-profit publisher. So think about exactly what's going on there, and the Pareto efficient outcome is for us to cooperate, to VCs, to contribute there to the public good. So in closing, the dismal science really doesn't automatically provide a happy ending in the case that we're each left to our own devices. What's different about this is we had to think about what other people in the room might be doing, and what we do affects what their outcomes are. So the economic analysis points to the need for government and for private foundations and for institutions that can engender trust and social capital, because if we all trusted each other to vote C, we would have all been much better off. So despite all the innovation and the other good things that profit-seeking companies can accomplish, we need to think beyond market forces alone if we want to achieve the potential that information technology has for promoting the public good. Thank you.
So as we move into the discussion with the audience, who we regard as panel participants as well, and as we move toward there, here's the quotation as promised from Michael Chabon, a Pulitzer Prize winner who wrote The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, and he's sometimes regarded as maybe the best of the young American writers. This is the last paragraph of the afterword to his 2007 book, Gentlemen of the Road. He says, well, you are to envision yourself. Look at yourself right now, sitting in your seat on a jet airplane. Let's say in your unearthly orange polyester and neoprene shoes, listening to digital music, crawling across the sky from Charlotte to Las Vegas, and hoping to lose yourself, your home, your certainties, the borders and barriers of your life, by means of a bundle of wood pulp sewn with glue and stained with blobs of pigment and resin? What in 2007 could be more incongruous than that? It makes me want to laugh. So, John and Leslie, are we going to handle questions with the Computer History Museum cards, or can anyone tell me what the, there is one. But let me take a question anyway.
Hi. Two things, actually. One is completely convinced about newspapers, because even before we had the computer, it was perfectly obvious as you were lugging home this that weighed more than you do, that you were only going to read about 1% of. What a waste that is. It's different for books. And one thing that I noticed that I've been thinking of all morning listening to you guys is when they invented the MP3, it seemed like within minutes, the record companies were in their death throes. You know, they started issuing lawsuits instead of records. The computer technology has been able to handle text way, way longer than that. You know, we could have had electronic books, and we did have electronic books, actually, long ago in computer terms, and yet books are still hanging in there, and I think, you know, physical paper books are still hanging in there, and I think that there's, they really do have more staying power than other media, other traditional media. And the other point I wanted to make is that I think, Ed, you made a mistake in restricting your selection of librarians to people at academic libraries. I would really like to hear somebody up on the panel who is from a municipal circulating library, which is, I think, most libraries. That's what libraries mostly are. And basically, the purpose of libraries is the circumvention of copyright laws. Really, that's what they're for. They're to circumvent copyright laws, and I think that that's a very noble purpose. And I'm really nervous about the distribution of books in digital media, because it's so easy to encrypt the digital media so as to prevent the circumvention of copyright laws.
So I know on the second part, you know, I'll actually give an answer that I would see. I know it sounds good to say circumvention of copyright laws. I mean, actually, it is to go after this fact that when you buy something, you actually can give it to other people, and the fact that then you can person and time shift. And I think your point actually is absolutely correct in that it's not about circumvention of copyright laws, but it's about for public good, that if somebody pays, because I believe the statistic is libraries account for, I think, 15% of the publishing industry, and that's what I've actually heard from. Huh? 12. But I mean, they generate a lot of money in circumventing copyright law. And the point is, how do you still find that right balance? Especially when one of the reasons that libraries, public libraries, there's a mitigation because there's a cost to going to the public library, you know, and a lot of people that have disposable money say, well, no, I'll just go to the bookstore, it's closer, I don't have to return it, I can take forever to read it. And as soon as you get to distribution of digital goods, now some of the friction that makes a public library, you know, limiting in some fashion goes away. And I know we had a lot of interesting discussions when we were talking about the agreement because of the ideas of a subscription for a public library or things like that, and how does that work. So I agree that I think that's one of the challenges of how do people that can't afford $20 a book or $30 a book, you know, gain access.
So, and on your first point, I would just say Jonathan Zittrain from Harvard Law School made an interesting observation in his panel yesterday, which is it's amazing today how quickly we're going from it's too soon to tell to it's too late to do anything about it. and I think with newspapers, we are actually seeing something pretty remarkable, which is the death of a medium by virtue of a new technology. That doesn't happen very much in mass media. You know, radio, movies, television, those things have all persisted in the face of other technologies coming along. And if you ask newspaper publishers 10 years ago, as John did, you know, and said, I'm not sure they would have predicted they'd be dead by the end of the first decade of this century. And I'm not sure, I wouldn't want to predict the future of books right now, today, based on that.
You know, the question touches on another aspect, which is the library as place. I mean, we keep hearing articles that say that libraries are emptied of their readers and so forth because of electronics. That is absolutely not the case in medical libraries. They're jam full. As place is an important thing, and what all medical librarians want more than anything else is small meeting rooms. Because people, again, the change in the pattern, people now study in 2s, 4s, and 6s. They don't study in those monk places of, you know, one person and a scroll. The library as place is a very important aspect.
On that, I've actually argued that the rise of Starbucks was completely because of the digital and the internet, and in fact replacing something that libraries had, because even while you're sitting on your laptop, you still want to have community, and you used to go to libraries for community, and Starbucks, you know, was replacing that community while you're sitting on your laptop.
I agree. We're going to coffee now.
Yes.
Move on to a question by Vince Cerf. It's a question which is very broad and therefore impacts all the panelists. Vint, you want to raise it yourself?
So the comment that was made earlier about incremental costs is fairly significant because the incremental cost of moving things around digitally is quite low. But when you think about the capital cost of building the internet and building the clouds that run on it and maintaining them and operating them, it's actually a very big number. So what's happened is that the electronic publication is taking advantage of someone's enormous investment in capital. I would the analogy to that is the investment that the newspapers make in these large printing systems. So all of the beauty of the low incremental cost of electronic publication and distribution is heavily dependent on our collective ability to keep the internet and the machines that are on it operating. So the question I have for the panel is, how significant is that? You know, as you paint this this future picture of online distribution and publication and everything else, what about the mechanism by which the infrastructure is maintained and operated and supported? There's money there needed to do that. How do we assure it? And Google's business model right now is based on advertising. If for some reason that particular model goes away, then a very big piece of infrastructure would go away, and some of the economics that we're benefiting from
wouldn't be there. So how do we cope with it? How do you think about that?
So what I know is that if you take out the printing and distribution costs from the total budget for a big academic journal, scholarly journal, you take out 40% of the costs. If you add back in 10%, that's the cost of creating an internet edition and distributing it, fully loaded, fully loaded. So it looks like a good ratio. It looks like reducing those printing and distribution costs saves a lot of money. And we pay a piece, as an internet service provider, we pay a piece to keep our servers alive, to pay for the network. For a while we had a private network around the world that was relatively affordable. It was riding on cables that had been installed for telephones, of course. They're going away too.
I guess what I'd say is, first of all, I think advertising has always been here and it always will be here. There may be new business models. Google may go out of business, blah, blah, blah. But to be honest, I think there has to be thinking of this, but everybody in this room probably pays $40 a month or something to help pay for this. And the internet is used for lots of big business, selling cameras and selling VCRs and selling and selling and selling. And so as long as the American economy is healthy, and now you can get into if it keeps going, but as long as the economy happens, there's so much business on there that as long as there's a business motivation, then people are going to be pumping money in. And luckily, I think when you talk a scholarship and these other things that often don't generate as much business, but the infrastructure is there due to all these business interests. And then you have things, I mean, Google Scholar is an example where Google doesn't make money off of Google Scholar, but their business interests elsewhere, and therefore that's helped scholarship. And I suspect that'll still be the case, that there's just going to be rife with business interests, that there'll be all sorts of people paying for that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that the example that you bring of the newspapers is exactly what we were talking about. Because there are large fixed costs, very low marginal costs, these days for distributing that kind of information, then you would tend to have monopoly, and the number of players, as we've seen, is really shrinking quite dramatically. But like any kind of infrastructure, any kind of public good, I would say, typically we have to make an agreement among ourselves that we're all going to contribute, that we're all going to pay our taxes, be a C player rather than a D player. And I don't need to remind Vint Cerf that the original infrastructure that we're all here talking about came about because of government investment. Yep. And it's that kind of sense of a public good and of being in this together that I think makes a difference.
I'm going to move to the next question. It's a question that was sent up here by Heather Bergman of Cambridge University Press. And one of the reasons for highlighting it is because I forgot to tell part of an anecdote before, and her question will trigger that. So, Heather, where are you?
Hello. So my question involves mainly the ways in which people use different types of content. So, for instance, is there going to be a difference between the way people will consume popular media like novels or newspapers electronically versus the way that they would use technical material such as journal articles, technical books, textbooks? And what are going to be the differences between the most appropriate platforms for each? For instance, it's one thing to read a novel on the Kindle or on your iPhone, but is that going to be sufficient for technical material?
I want to to grab on first. The anecdote that I told before about the 13-year-old who spent $300 of his own money, the largest purchase of his life, buying a Sony e-reader. I found that out from his father, who's a friend of mine, and I emailed back, and we had exactly this discussion, and it turned out that the 13-year-old uses the Sony e-reader for nonfiction and textbooks. But when he reads fiction and he takes a book to bed, he takes a paper book with him. And I sent back an email saying, don't understand that. Why? And the answer was, I just like it better. It feels warmer.
So the other answer is that there's a convergence happening. And if you look carefully at the Kindle 2, you see it's more interactive than was Kindle 1. I don't know about the Sony ebook reader. I haven't played with one of them recently. But I think that there is convergence happening, and I do believe it'll be possible to have interactive content, not yet color content, but interactive content on an ebook reader. And I read my Kindle everywhere I go, including to bed.
And I guess I have to put in a plug for PDF, because the latest versions now incorporate full video and interactivity and reformatting and scaling and all kinds of things that the traditional book doesn't do, or the traditional representation, and yet it subsumes all the technical, mathematical symbolization, handling, and topography. And I think that the goal here of the future of having things to be highly interactive and highly expressive and having embedded videos and sound is happened. And now it's just up to sort of the authoring community to catch up to that.
I guess my thought is that, and in terms of journal articles, the transition already happened. Mike can probably say the percentage of journal articles accessed electronically through the physical, it's I think 80% electronic in his library or something like that. But I know from my personal experience, when I was still actually able to do real research as opposed to now when I mostly manage, I would actually go and get an electronic version, I'd print it out. And I actually think you're going to see I personally think the Kindle's the wrong form factor for technical stuff. I think publishers figured out over many, many years that a bigger form factor was right. It's not by chance that novels are this big and technical journals are that big. And personally, I think it's the wrong form factor. And there are tons of folks, and I'm sure Amazon and other folks will come up with different forms.
Just hold your breath, Dan. Hold your breath, because that technology can be any size you want it to be.
That's my point. I think there'll be other versions. There'll be other versions of these things that will have a more appropriate form factor for some of this stuff, is my belief.
The most successful magazines are the full-color, full large-size, high-resolution things that are women's magazines for fashion, and those are the ones that are hanging in there because the computer doesn't yet deliver that kind of quality.
Yeah. I was going to say that from the point of view of molecular biology, which is what a lot of NIH is focused on now, the display is much less important than the linkages. So what will typically happen? I mean, we're in the middle of this genome revolution, and there are many, many more discoveries yet to be made. So every day you find that an analysis is done, and you have to look for where are conserved elements and so forth, and out of a genome-wide association study, there may be a suggestion that certain people with a certain disease have maybe this feature in the genes. Now, typically, you don't have any idea what the gene does. I mean, truthfully. So that's where all of the other animals come in, the smaller beings, as it were. So you can find out, oh, well, gosh, in the tomato plant or the little tiny 1 millimeter worm, now we know what that gene does in them, so that gives you an idea. Then you can go back to, the human study. So it's the linkages going back and forth between these things that are totally vital to unraveling the genomic revolution. And the displays are, I think you might be right on the form factor, but for us it matters much less than that. Somebody has already done the linkages, and that's the NLM role, really, to pre-compute the linkages to the extent we can do that.
I want to move on to a simple question. So it's posed on the card. It's from Peter Friedland, but I'll read it myself. The simple question, and Peter wants to provoke you into making a prediction. Simple question, 20 years from today, so that's what, 2029, will the typical Stanford undergraduate be buying physical textbooks for his or her courses?
No, not buying them now.
Yeah. 5 years from now, they won't be. Yeah, 5 years.
See? Yeah. Peter said it was a simple question. Yeah. So is that unanimous? Does everyone agree with that? Next thing is that several of the questions that have been submitted relate to the same topic. So I'll just summarize the topic and you can quote on it. The people in the audience are questioning, probing, and worrying about the author business model, the author incentives in this new world. Can you cover that? Maybe while you're thinking, let me just say that, that to make it more specific, when you go to Borders and try to buy a new book, you're paying about $25 for it, roughly, $26 for a new book. You go to the Kindle edition at Amazon, it's $9.99, and that really squeezes down everything else into that $10 range. And how much of that is the author going to get, and how is the author going to get it?
So the question can be answered for the popular literature in the following way. Would you rather sell 100 copies at $25 or 2,500 copies at $10? And if your royalty percentage is fixed regardless of the format, it's based on gross or net, you'd obviously want to sell 2,500 books at $10. And I think that's the basis for the Amazon business model. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Or would you rather sell 25,000 at $1? I mean,
there you go.
because self-publishing, I mean, there was great concern over investigative reporting and what the future of that without newspapers. It is not up to the newspapers to save investigative reporting. It's investigative reporting to find the business models along with online delivery that work. And the bloggers are working very heavily at this and very hard at this. Authors are going to have to be more independent because you had to go through a publisher before because they had the infrastructure and distribution structure and all of this stuff that allowed you to reach an audience. Now there's a zillion ways to reach an audience, and the authors have to find those ways along, and the business models along with that.
I know he's waiting, so.
Yeah, I was just going to say that economists have only begun really studying this from the point of view of what's called two-sided markets, where you have two different kinds of people that are interested in your platform, and you charge them differently. So think about a credit card. If you're a vendor, if you're someone in business, you want to know that that credit card has lots and lots of people using it. So you want the price for the users to be very low. On the other hand, if you're signing up for a credit card, then you want to know that lots and lots of vendors are going to honor it. Similarly, if you're making a video game, you have to think about both the side of the market that has to do with the developers for your platform and also the users. And similarly then for an academic journal, that you want to price, we've traditionally priced things so that the readers would pay rather than the authors. But that's now switched because of these network effects. You want to make sure that you have a large readership, and you have to balance out these two interests, and that's why we've switched over to having authors pay more often. And in fact, in the case of Adobe, the idea that you would make the readers zero cost was one of the things that changed the economics of that completely because of the network effects. If everyone is using that reader, then you want to use it, and then you can sell the other side of it for quite a bit. So that is something where the analytics are still just being worked out by the economists, but it's a very prevalent once you start thinking about a kind of model that I would invite you to just try to analyze.
Making the reader free was a really good idea.
So on this, I mean, I actually think this is a critical. I want to ask you, everybody who's an author, raise your hand. Now, everyone who made their living when they were an author, predominantly, keep your hand up. Okay, so for those that kept their hands up, I actually think they're challenges. Because part of the kind of unspoken, I think John can talk about this, was advances. In fact,
I was just about to say that.
Publishers would give advances, and in general, some, only a lot of people wouldn't make back their advance, but the publisher would make that back on, a lot of people that would make a lot. And now with the long tail, you're going to have the number of people that are going to be able to make a living from being an author, especially because what happens in music is you see that the tip of the head kind of stays good, and then everything comes up. And so for aggregators, they can make a little bit off of a lot. But for an individual author, if you shift some of the middle out to the tail, now what you're doing is you're taking people that were already marginal and moving them down this way, and you're distributing some of the revenue. But in terms of the number of people that are up at a point on the curve where they actually can pay their bills, it's possibly those people in the middle that there are fewer than. And you get the big hits, but you lose some of the middle that can provide. John, I mean.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it was just the advances point was the only one I was going to touch on, Ed, which is that trade publishing is already a Hollywood star system. The big sellers get the big advances, but the current economic model demands that advances go away as quickly as possible. So I think the only big question is going to be, will publishers start paying Oprah to make the book of the month club book, because that sells more books from more trade publishers than any single thing they could do.
I have the most important card in this whole stack is the one from Leslie that says, "We must quit," underline, in about 3 minutes. So since we only have 3 minutes, I just picked out of all of these cards the most provocative question. Michael Stryker of UCSF. Michael, are you around? Could you get a microphone so you can ask it yourself? It's pretty provoking.
With 3 minutes.
It's a short question. You've talked about libraries in the plural, and a lot of the support for the libraries has come about because the great institutions, the great universities, the great cities have had to have a great library, and that kind of competition has provided a base of support for the libraries. So why in the digital world should there ever be more than one library? And what implications does this have for the support for libraries?
Yeah.
Well, I would return to the proposition of the library as place. That's why they have a library. It's a good place. You know, you can start out with the university in the same way. The university is a place. But I don't think you're going to disappear either of those as physical and important centers of a campus. Typically was a library, is a library, will continue to be a library. And the people there do a lot more than dust the books. So I think those services and functions will becoming more important, not less, as you find users having to wade through billions of nucleotides and millions of articles. They need the help of librarians.
Also, I think variation counts and distributed systems count, and the remarks about the public libraries today reflected in the newspapers today, huge numbers of people in the economic downturn showing up at public libraries. The difference between a small public library in a small town that has access to Google and a big city library is reduced by Google Books. Nevertheless, I think the role of the libraries is strong, particularly in the area of special collections, not widely distributed digital items.
But as they all become electronic and the rare books get digitized, I see no reason why libraries can't be totally distributed across the world and share content.
And I think when you look at, I mean, there's the academic library, but when you look at the public library, where more and more in local communities, budgets are very tight, and then they start cutting services, I think there are going to be some challenges as more and more are getting access to the information, not through the library. And I think one of the challenges we face also is Library of Congress, which is not really a national library like other countries have in terms of preservation and other things, that in terms of government investment at the top, that we need to look at some of that investment, because historically the money always came out in lots of places at the bottom or at the universities, and that economic model may not sustain it, which is goes to what Vint was saying, where sometimes you might need investment from the top.
It looks like Daniel wants the last comment.
Who says we have more than one library? I mean, there's a certain sense in which the internet is now one big library. I think what you want to worry about is whether you just want one curator.
First, let me ask you to join me in thanking this panel. It was extraordinarily informative on a really and truly important discussion. We thank you very much. Second, really regret to say that the program has come to an end, but it has to, especially because we all are now going to have the opportunity to view the really wonderful exhibits of this very exceptional museum, which they have graciously arranged to have private tours for us. It's open to the public at noon. So immediately after we conclude, which is no more than 30 seconds, there will be docents and some of our speakers who are involved in the museum available in the gallery downstairs to explain to you and answer any questions about the artifacts. My final task is to thank all of you for coming here this morning and making this such a wonderful event, and for coming throughout the weekend, and to formally dissolve the 1939th stated meeting of the Academy.